was believed to be trustworthy, loving, and professional. But sadly, behind her fake persona was a deranged serial killer who took the lives of more than 31 people. Hi guys, welcome back for another whispered video. If you are a fan of historical true crime and scary stories, that is generally what I do here on my channel, and I will just take a second to ask if you could please kindly hit the like button and consider subscribing. Those things help me out tremendously, and it is so appreciated. I really can't tell you how much they mean to me. Okay, let's get into the video and head to Boston, Massachusetts. Jane was actually born Honora Kelly on March 31st, 1854 in Boston, and she was the youngest daughter of Bridget and Paul Kelly. Her parents were immigrants from Ireland, and they had two older daughters named Delia Josephine and Nellie. Jane's mother passed away from tuberculosis when she was only 1 year old, so her father was left to raise all three daughters on his own. Paul suffered from alcohol abuse, and many people refer to him as Kelly the Crack, meaning crackpot. This term implied that Jane's father was seen as a very eccentric and foolish person, but it was also clear that he was likely suffering from some sort of mental illness. While working as a tailor in Massachusetts, it said that he had gone to work one day and sewed both of his eyes shut. Because of his challenges, Paul did end up being institutionalized at one point, and the behaviors that Jane witnessed from a very early age were likely contributing factors to the evil acts that she would go on to commit. 3 years after Bridget passed away, Paul committed Jane and her sister Delia to the Boston Female Asylum She went to the home of a woman named Mrs. Anne C. Toppan, and this was under an act called indentured servitude. She would be working as a servant, and in exchange for serving the Toppan family, she would get a room, food, a roof over her head, and essentially a family. Because of the stigma associated with the Irish, the Toppans told family and friends that Jane was an Italian girl whose family had died at sea. They also renamed her Jane Toppan because it sounded less Irish. Jane was a good student and did good work for the Toppan family. Though Anne was described as being pretty cold, Jane and Anne's daughter Elizabeth became very, very close. At 18, Jane graduated from high school, and Anne said that she was free to leave, but she decided to stay as a regular servant and lived with the Toppans for over 20 years, well after Anne passed away. Elizabeth and Anne at this point had become more like sisters. In 1887, Elizabeth's husband, named Orimal Brigham, moved into the Toppan house, and Jane decided that it was finally time to move out. It was here where she began training as a nurse at Cambridge Hospital, and where her depravity begins. When Jane began her residency, meaning she was a full-fledged nurse, basically in the final stages of her training, this is where she began doing horrendous experiments on the patients under her care, and she killed many of them. Jane began experimenting on her patients and treating them like lab rats. She wanted to see what different concoctions, mixtures, and dosages of medications would do to them. And she chose the patients who couldn't fight back and who couldn't say no. Her drugs of choice were morphine and atropine. Morphine is a drug within the opiate family, and it affects the central nervous system, and it is typically used to treat pain. Atropine is a medication that can be used to treat certain types of poisons, in addition to some types of slowed heart rates. Jane would visit with patients who had been given proper prescribed dosages of these medications by their doctors, and she would deliberately alter the dosages. She would give them incredibly high dosages and then keep detailed notes on how their nervous systems responded. A patient given an incorrect dose of morphine can develop symptoms including, but not limited to, difficulty breathing, very slow breathing, extreme tiredness, an inability to speak, drowsiness, nausea, vomiting, seizures, and death. A patient given an incorrect dosage of atropine could face rapid heartbeat, loss of balance, blurred vision, lack of sweating, dry mouth, and dizziness. Jane also experimented by giving these patients incredibly large doses of sedatives. This was to ensure that they couldn't fight back or call for help, but it was also to ensure that they would go into this sort of zombie-like state where they would lose consciousness and not remember the things that Jane had done to them. She would then falsify the patient's charts so no other doctors or nurses would know what she had done. Even worse, while her patients were in these unconscious, zombie-like states, Jane would climb into bed with them and caress them. And it would later come out that this was partly why she did this. She derived pleasure from this. One of Jane's patients lived to remember and recall the horrors that her nurse had put her through while she was staying in the hospital. In 1887, Amelia Finney was the post-operative patient of Jane Toppan. In an interview, Amelia described that post-operation, Jane had given her some sort of medication that tasted extremely bitter and rendered her unconscious. When she awoke the next morning, she recalled having a very scary dream that Jane had climbed into bed with her after her operation and had begun kissing her face all over. When Jane was finally apprehended by police, she admitted to gaining erotic pleasure from doing this, from seeing her patients on the cusp of death and then coming back to life and then passing away, all the while laying with them and caressing them while this was happening. She enjoyed having this ultimate power and control over her victims, and it was easy for her to do this because she generally picked victims who were old, weak, and feeble. One of the most terrifying things about this woman was that she was able to hide what she was doing for so long. And while working at Cambridge Hospital, she was known as one of the best nurses that they had. This is where she gained her nickname of Jolly Jane, because she was so well loved and friendly towards her patients. But behind the curtain, she was a real-life monster. While her co-workers saw her as friendly and lovable, there were some red flags in Jane's past that came out after she was arrested. While in nursing school, fellow students as well as doctors couldn't help but notice Jane's unhealthy obsession with autopsies, and this was recalled as being a definite red flag that they had not noticed at the time. In 1889, Jane was recommended for a job at the esteemed Massachusetts General Hospital, where she went and she didn't really face any repercussions. She then returned to Cambridge Hospital, but this return was pretty short-lived, as she was actually caught this time for again giving away too much medication to patients. This time she was caught for giving away too many opiates. You might think that it was here where she finally lost her license or got into some serious trouble, right? Wrong. Instead, it was here where she decided to pursue a career in the private nursing sector. She even had the blessing and recommendations from the doctors at the hospital. This is even more terrifying to think about because Jane now had access to patients in their homes, their personal, private spaces where they should have felt nothing but safety and security. Jane was no longer in a hospital surrounded by other people who could possibly see what she was doing. She no longer had to worry about faking charts or getting caught. She finally gained a position of ultimate power and control over her victims, with nobody to hover over her as she did it. In 1895, Jane poisoned her landlords, Israel Dunham and his wife. It turned out that Jane had a strange animosity towards older individuals. A few students she attended nursing school with actually remembered Jane stating that there was no point in keeping older people alive. She viewed the elderly as useless, and in a sick way, almost saw this as a justification for killing them. When she later admitted her crimes to the police, she said her justification for killing Israel Dunham and his wife was because they were weak, feeble, fragile, hard to please, old, and cranky. In 1889, Jane tried a new type of poison outside of prescribed medications. She had a good friend who worked as the head of medical arrangements at a boarding school, and Jane decided that she wanted this job for herself. So she simply used strychnine to poison and kill her friend and take her position. Strychnine is a highly toxic poison that can be used as a pesticide to kill rodents, at least at the time. It's colorless and bitter and was an easy way to poison people. Jane actually did end up getting her friend's job, but was quickly let go for her bad attitude and incompetence, as well as the fact that money would always seem to go missing whenever Jane was on shift. The next documented case of Jane using the poisonous pesticide was on her own foster sister. Despite the two girls being close, Jane's depravity did not distinguish between family and strangers. In 1899, Elizabeth invited her sister over for a picnic on the beach. This was something that the women did often, and it was something that they really enjoyed doing together. Elizabeth had no knowledge of the monster her sister had become. had poisoned their mineral water with strychnine, which was quickly becoming her new favorite weapon. After drinking the water, Elizabeth died on the beach in her sister's arms. While Jane was explaining the murder of her sister to police, she described it with a smile, as if it were a happy memory for her to recall. She told the police, "I held her in my arms and watched with delight as she gasped her life out." In 1901, Jane's lies, secrets, and murder spree would finally, slowly start to come to an end. On July 4th, an old friend of Jane's named Maddie Davis, who was ill, died under Jane's care, and it was, of course, Jane who had poisoned and killed her. Maddie lived in a small Massachusetts neighborhood, and when her body was sent home for burial, Jane actually ended up going with her deceased friend to make sure she got there okay. Having no idea that it was Jane who had killed his wife, Maddie's husband, Alden Davis, actually hired Jane to stay at his home and work as the family nurse to care for him and his family now that his wife was gone. 3 weeks later, Mr. Davis's daughter, Annie Gordon, died at the hands of Jane. 3 days after her murder, Alden died from a supposed stroke. 3 weeks after his death, his other daughter, Mary Gibbs, also passes away. Not only had Jane murdered an old friend who trusted her, she then went on to take the lives of her entire family. After the Davis family massacre, Jane ended up moving back home to her hometown and actually attempted to seduce her sister's widower, Ormal Brigham. Her plan had been to try and marry him all along, and with Elizabeth now dead, she could attempt her plan. The first thing Jane had to do was eliminate Ormal's 77-year-old sister, Edna Bannister, who lived with him. After killing Edna, Jane began really trying to court her sister's husband. She tried to impress him and win him over, but he really didn't want anything to do with her. In being turned down, Jane ended up poisoning him, but not to the point of death. She had a sick, twisted plan to give him just enough toxin to make him sick enough so that she could miraculously cure him and bring him back to optimal health. And then Jane thought that he would fall madly in love with her. She figured that in bringing him back from sickness, this would somehow prove to him that she was worthy of his love, or impress him so much that he would simply want to marry her. She even went so far as to poison herself, which some say was a call for sympathy due to his unrequited love for her. But after the failed pursuit of her late sister's husband, he demanded that she reports were not something that was done very often at this time, and were probably pretty expensive as well. So, I'm assuming that Jane probably never expected family members of her victims to really dig deeper into their deaths. But this family did. When the toxicology report on Alden's daughter came back, it stated that without a doubt, her cause of death had been poisoning from morphine and atropine. Finally, Jane's atrocious crimes and her freedom would soon be over. On October 29th, 1901, she was arrested for murder. During her discussion with the police, she openly admitted to at least 31 murders, but also told them that her victim count could be as high as 100. She wasn't exactly sure. The story of her arrest and prosecution spread throughout Massachusetts, and some surviving patients